In D&D, we already explore fantasy worlds, but there are more unique worlds beyond these places that can allow for incredible adventures, unique people, plots, and places that you can bring into your games. In this episode of Experience Gain, that's what we're going to talk about. Hi, I'm Jeremy, I'm a writer, and this is my YouTube channel where I make videos about all things imaginary. This week, we're talking about Dungeons & Dragons and how you can get the most out of your role-playing games. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Shadowfell, because this is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for some time, ever since I made my Feywild video, and I've just been missing talking about D&D. It's been over 2 months since I made a D&D video, and I'm really sad to be missing out on the D&D live event here in LA this weekend. So I'm making a D&D video to try and make up for it and get a little bit of D&D back into my life. As we dive into the Shadowfell in this video, I want to talk about how you can integrate it into your game, into your worlds, and how you can make it compelling for your players at the table. In order to do both of those things, it's important to understand what the Shadowfell actually is. Now, in D&D, the core base fantasy world that you play in is known as the material plane. And the Shadowfell, like the Feywild, is a twisted reflection of the material plane. What that means is that if you place the material plane and the Shadowfell side by side, you'd recognize a lot of similarities in common, but the Shadowfell would have very distinctive, distinguishing features that make it different from the material plane that your players and their characters know. Now, the Shadowfell often gets a bad rap, but it's not necessarily a place of evil. Instead, it's a place of death and shadow, which are both natural parts of the world and of the D&D cosmology. And within that cosmology, the Shadowfell occupies an important place. If you take a coin, for example, well, the center of that coin, right, would really be the material plane. But on either side of that coin, you'd have kind of extreme reflections, extreme versions of it. On one side, you'd have the Feywild, which is a place of manic emotions, of extreme emotions that range wildly. And on the side of the Shadowfell, you have very subdued emotions. The way those emotions are subdued is a manifestation of part of the integral magics of the Shadowfell that colors everything in that plane, from the actual locales to the people to just the structure metaphysically of this imaginary setting. Now, typically the Shadowfell is flavored in one of two ways. It's characterized as either a plane of death or a plane of shadow. You can definitely take elements from both, but deciding on a core feature, a core premise, we could say, for your Shadowfell in your games will help you make it that much more compelling, that much more interesting, and that much more understandable for your players. Cosmology and metaphysics in the D&D world can get out of hand and very complicated very quickly, so I find that it's important to simplify them sometimes and make them easier to understand for your players, so that if you are playing a campaign in which they're going through a lot of different settings, a lot of different planes, your players can have a very clear understanding of what makes this plane special and unique and how it relates to the other planes around it. If you decide to characterize the Shadowfell in your games as a plane of death, then that probably means the Shadowfell is a place kind of like eternal purgatory. It's nihilistic, it's uncaring, it's eternal suppression for the souls that end up there. It's probably, in that way, the domain of the dead, where many, if not all, souls end up after they die. If that's the direction that you choose to go, then the Shadowfell occupies a very important place in your world as a domain of the dead, right? It's going to be pretty busy. More people have probably died in your world than are living currently. Whether all those souls did end up in the Shadowfell and how they actually manifest there is up to you, and is something we'll talk about a little later on. On the other side, if you characterize the Shadowfell as a plane of shadow, you can take a more elemental bend to it, like the elemental planes of fire. Here, the Shadowfell can be more malicious and vicious, calling upon the somewhat sinister characteristics of shadow as an element. In either case, the Shadowfell is definitely not bland. I think it gets misconstrued that way a lot of the time, which is just totally unfair. This is really an exciting and interesting and compelling nightmarish setting that your players can step into that is extremely magical, like the Feywild. But because all the emotions there are subdued and the nature of the plane itself is somewhat sorrowful, somewhat darker, it can be tough to find a good way to allow your players to step into it in a way that's exciting and interesting for them. Not only do you have those nightmarish reflections of the material plane there, which can allow for some really interesting creative RP or allow players to see places they already know in new and compelling ways, you can also hide lost treasures there, like sentient magic weapons. For example, if you look at the Hexblade archetype for Warlocks, the sentient magic weapon Black Razor seems to have its origins in the Shadowfell. If you take it as a plane of shadow, you can also have the origins of shadow magic be in the Shadowfell. That would make sense, right? Shadow magic sorcerers, like from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, can be drawing on the elemental power of that plane, or perhaps carry blood from the original denizens of that plane, whatever you make them be. The Shadowfell doesn't need to be dull and black and white. Instead, it can be lively with this dark and sinister magic. You can have many lost secrets, hidden mysteries there, because it is a sinister place, a dark place, where there are more places to hide than there are to be seen. If you go back to the Manual of the Planes from 3rd edition, this is how it describes the Shadowfell. It is the toxic place of darkness and power. It is the hidden place that hates the light. It is the frontier of worlds unknown. If that doesn't get you excited about the Shadowfell and what secrets and mysteries and adventures it might hold, that's okay. But there's so much potential here to explore that I think it would be a shame for you and your players to miss out on it in your games. Now, with any plane like this, any sort of extraterrestrial place that your characters are going to step into, I think it's really important to know who rules in your world, who rules in the Shadowfell, who is the dominant force or power there. If you want to build the Shadowfell the same way that it's built and construed in 5th edition, then you are going to be looking towards the Raven Queen. Now, the Raven Queen is a really cool deity, and this is how 5th edition describes her relationship to the Shadowfell. I can't memorize all this, so I'm going to read it. She rules from her raven throne within the Fortress of Memories, a maze-like castle deep within the bleakness of the Shadowfell. From there, she sends out her ravens to find interesting souls she can pluck from various planes of existence. Once they are in the Shadowfell, she watches as these souls attempt to unravel the mystery of their being and ultimately go mad in the process. If you decide to use the Raven Queen, there's a ton of information available about her online that you can find. Great videos produced by D&D about her as well. But don't feel limited or restricted to her. You can choose your own god, make one of your own, or a separate god that you like from the various D&D mythologies. You can also go with a totally different sort of cosmology, or even perhaps have a war between powers in the Shadowfell where there is no clear singular ruler. Now, it's really great to have that world building, but all that world building doesn't really mean much if you don't know how your players are going to interact with it. And the core to that question is figuring out, like we did with the Feywild video, how are your players actually going to get into the Shadowfell? If they're not at high enough levels that they don't have access to the magic items or the abilities that will allow them to shift into those planes, well then, you need to figure out the points in your world where that crossover is possible. Perhaps you can play upon the old wives' tales, rumors you can seed into your world of people just disappearing into shadows, walking down a dark alley never to be seen again. If you're playing a high magic campaign, that can be one way to introduce the Shadowfell into your world. You can also tie it to darker forces. Perhaps there are rituals to satiate a place with death and shadow so that it might open a sympathetic connection to the Shadowfell. If the Shadowfell is a reflection of the material plane, then if a cultist can make the material plane similar to the Shadowfell equivalent of that place, then perhaps you can step into and cross over to the Shadowfell in that way. That's part of the logic of how people cross over into the Feywild, and it's part of the mythology around the plane hopping in the Feywild and Shadowfell from the material plane that I actually really like personally. You could also have areas of permanent portals. These would be shrines to dark gods where you would have dangerous, shadowy beings and monsters often step through from the Shadowfell into the material plane. Hi, Tiger. Come here. Hi. Here's a shadowy monster. That's all you came for? Alright. Once your players actually step into the Shadowfell, then it's up to you as their dungeon master to allow them to really understand what that experience is like for their characters. Generally, this is one way that you could go about describing the Shadowfell. No moon or stars, only inky blackness in the sky. Imagine literally being in an ink pot type of thing. By that same virtue, there's just a lack of color and light all around, and any sort of lights that they might produce only illuminate half the distance that they might otherwise. Dark vision in this way could become pretty important mechanically. With less color and light, there's also less heat, and so your characters, your players' characters, will be cold. They'll be shivering, even if they're used to cold climates. This is an unnatural cold, an elemental or primal cold of death and shadow. All around them, the landscapes and settings that they might otherwise have known or recognized are instead constructed in bizarre and seemingly morbid ways. The material used, the architecture of the buildings, everything a little bit darker and more sinister. Spires of obsidian and perhaps Gothic architecture, if that is the aesthetic that you'd like to use. Confronted with these issues, your players will need to figure out how to survive the Shadowfell for as long as their sojourn there extends. When they try to hunt and forage for food, what they find will be foul-smelling and strange to their palate. It will be harder to cook because the flames of their campfire will put out less heat. And while these are not really mechanical influences, though you could try to include some sort of survival mechanic or around exhaustion if you wanted to, you definitely don't have to. And sometimes just the narrative flavor of encouraging your players to roleplay this or describing the setting in this way, making it more of a scene to them, can do a lot of the work of making a place feel unique and compelling from what they're used to. In the material plane, you take these things for granted. Climate, a lot of the time, finding food or hunting for it. But in the Shadowfell, all bets are off. Things are far too different here for your players to be comfortable in average day in the Shadowfell. Personally, rather than a full survival mechanic that focuses on the physical state of your players, I prefer to focus on their emotional state. Because the Shadowfell is a place of subdued emotions, whether by shadow or by death, you can characterize the Shadowfell as draining the emotions of the characters that are in there the longer they stay there. You can represent this by having the characters make wisdom saving throws of increasingly tougher difficulty and suffering points of exhaustion if they fail them. But beyond just the point of exhaustion, you can also force them or really encourage them, if your players are inclined to do this, to roleplay into having their emotions feel more subdued. They just won't have as much impetus or energy to go out and do things as they slowly lose their sense of self to this supernatural drain of the Shadowfell. There are also other elements that you could include, such as shadowquakes. Shadowquakes are what they sound like. They are earthquakes in the Shadowfell, but they can even bend the very planes themselves. Perhaps a shadowquake that touches on a dark and shadowy alley is what brings your players into the Shadowfell if you want to go into a more accidental transportation sort of route. And if these quakes are so powerful to be disturbing the rift between planes or pulling people out of spells like Shadow Walk, where they might temporarily go into the Shadowfell, well then maybe something is causing these shadowquakes, and maybe that's something your players can investigate. I also think that the Shadowfell is a really cool opportunity as a plane of powerful magic to mess with your spellcasters that are in your adventuring group. Don't just tell them that the Shadowfell is different, show it. Spells that use heat through perhaps fire damage and things like that, or illuminate light, might have a chance of just fizzling out or work at a reduced efficiency here. On the flip side, spells that draw on shadow could enhance. Players don't usually like it when they just get a flat-out punishment, so presenting it as a two-sided coin that encourages them to play into the nature of the Shadowfell could be really cool. But perhaps the more your characters use their shadow magic, they might become increasingly tainted by the energies of the Shadowfell. And finally, you could even take things a little further by playing into the idea of shadow stuff. Shadow stuff would be a way through which illusions could be made manifest. When they cast minor illusion in this world or other illusionary spells, perhaps they will actually physically manifest as the essence of the Shadowfell essentially fleshes out these illusions. Doesn't matter whether the target believes them or not. Here in the Shadowfell, illusions can become real things. Not only does this open up some really cool roleplay opportunities for your players, it also opens the doors to some interesting monsters and adversaries that your players can be confronted with, in addition to the usual suspects that you can find in the Shadowfell. These include shadow creatures, like a shadow mastiff, or perhaps a nightmare, or shadow scale lizard folk, right? Lizard folk that are tied to this elemental plane. And, of course, undead. Shadows, right? They are very appropriately named. Ghosts, vampires, liches, necromancers. Whether you're using the Shadowfell as a plane of death or a plane of shadow, undead can occupy a huge place in it. Obviously, if it's a plane of death, the role that they play can be a little bit different and a little bit more elaborate. If you are going to use undead in your version of the Shadowfell, then I highly recommend that you focus on the ethereal undead, like the shadows, specters, and wraiths that drain strength and life from their enemies. I think that sort of draining characteristic, to me, is one of the really integral, cool characteristics of the Shadowfell, what makes it special and unique, and applying that to the monsters your players face within it will only underscore that aspect of it. Of course, as much as the Shadowfell is a nightmarish place, it's not purely a place of monsters. There are civilizations there too. Organizations that your players might find could include an order of shadow sorcerers or shadow monks, or perhaps shadow scale dragonborn, born of shadow dragons, that elemental energy of shadow in the form of a draconic being. You could also explore the humanoid society of Shadowvar. These are humans with a deeper connection to the elemental plane of shadow, to the element of shadow within the Shadowfell, and some of which can actually merge completely with shadow, becoming creatures called shades. Any humanoid adversary you can think of, you can treat a Shadowvar as, but in addition, give them shadowy based abilities like perhaps invisibility or shadow step. Make them better at stealth and deceit and cunning, and just make them perhaps more sinister. Alternatively to the Shadowvar, there are also the Shadar-Kai. These are humanoids who bind themselves in service to the Raven Queen, which ties back to this idea of perhaps using the Raven Queen as the leader of the Shadowfell in your world. If she's just one faction, then you could still have the Shadar-Kai be her supporters. Like the Shadowvar, the Shadar-Kai carry the essence of the Shadowfell within them, but they have not fully merged, they have not fully taken advantage of that connection, and instead they might just see things differently. They see that connection as a sort of shadow curse. If they allow this curse to overwhelm them, then perhaps they might become beings and creatures of shadow and undeath. Creatures usually restrained to the afterlife. The way that this curse affects them is by imbuing them with more essence of the Shadowfell, continuing to laden them with that sense of subdued emotions, with that sense of grief and morbidness and sadness and dourness that is integral to the Shadowfell. In order to combat that, they seek out extreme experiences. They're essentially the adrenaline junkies of the D&D universes. The strong emotions that they might experience doing something like getting a tattoo, fighting in a life or death combat, going on insane epic adventures. These are the things that give them the emotional strength and wherewithal, and perhaps the kind of metaphysical magical power to fend off this shadow curse. They know that they will die eventually, but they do not fear it. They see it as inevitable. After all, they live in the plane of death and shadow, so they understand it very well. Instead of seeking immortality through magical means, though perhaps some might if you want to introduce a lich into your adventures there, they instead seek immortality through their deeds, through their actions, through leaving behind legends and stories of all that they did and accomplished. It's a really cool side effect and byproduct of this life that they live in an attempt to free themselves to live freely of the shadow curse that binds them. In a heroic campaign, perhaps your players can try to free these people from the shadow curse, or understand the source of that magic, or influence the politics of the Shadowfell and get involved in the warring factions trying to take it over. I really think that the Shadowfell is ripe for adventure, ripe for plots and really cool narrative opportunities that your players can engage with that will be super fun for you as a dungeon master to run as well. You want to have a ghost ship of undead? There's not really a better place for that than the Shadowfell, a looming massive dreadnought on the horizon, sailing through a twisted reflection of the seas of the material plane, where shadowy monsters shadowy monsters lurk underneath the water. They probably leak too, but That's not important. One of the ideas that I've had for a while that I just haven't had the chance to use yet, maybe your players need to find a respected legendary hero who got lost, got trapped in the Shadowfell. And instead, they find there a really sad, sordid kind of reflection of this hero that has been drained of all emotion, drained of all vigor. And it's up to the heroes to re-inspire, it's up to your players, rather, to re-inspire this hero to regaining this mantle, to being freed from the Shadowfell, to returning to the material plane and regaining their sense of self, becoming again the person they once were so that they can do something important, whether that's teach the heroes something valuable or give them the piece of information that they need or accomplish a task that they can only accomplish, perhaps by birth or blood. I also think the Shadowfell can be an extremely tempting form of power, a sort of plane-based warlock patron with opportunities you can present to all of your players, especially the more magically inclined ones. What would your players do with the opportunity to become a shade presented in front of them? Many players in D&D, many of the players that I've played with, want to be powerful. They want to be as strong as possible. And if you give them a really good carrot, you can attach some really fun strings along the way. Essentially, present them power and force them to deal with the consequences of accepting that if they do. Allow them to become more in tune with the shadowy abilities or gain new spells of elemental shadow and death. Force them to pay a price or sacrifice something of themselves in return, whether it's an emotion or something that they specifically need to actually do and accomplish in order to gain this power. And make sure to keep pulling those strings as they progress beyond it. You and your players can have a really fun and exciting jaunt in the Shadowfell. It does not have to be long. It can be just a couple of sessions, even a single session if you really want to cram it in there. Just because the Shadowfell is a plane of shadow and death, it doesn't have to be slow or unexciting. Instead, it can be thrilling. It can be a place of high adventure. It just means that the surroundings are a lot darker and more sinister than many of us are used to. It's a very different flavor than the kind of darkness we get in a setting like Ravenloft, for example. But I really like the Shadowfell, and I think that if you have a campaign primarily set in the material plane, you'd be really well served by having your players spend time not only in the material plane, but also in the Feywild and Shadowfell. Each of those places work really well on their own, and I think they all work really better when you get to see them in relationship to each other. See how one thing in the material plane is reflected differently in both the Feywild and the Shadowfell. And hopefully, if you're planning on using the Shadowfell in your games or weren't planning on doing so before, you now have new ideas, more ideas, interesting ideas about ways to integrate it, things that could be fun for your players to do. I encourage you to personalize a lot of what I've talked about for the players and characters in your party. Give them opportunities to do cool things, give them temptations that will drag them in, hooks that you know they will bite onto, whether that's powerful treasure or secret magics or things like that, and encourage them to be the ones to want to explore the Shadowfell. As always, I'm Jeremy. I make new videos every Friday about different nerdy topics. I haven't made a D&D video in a while since before this, but I've got a bunch I've made already if you want to go back and check those out, and many more that I have planned for the future to come. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.